In the spring of 1931, on the fifth floor of the Herald Square Hotel at 19 West 31st Street in Manhattan, a physician knocked on the door of Suite 552 and waited. He had been summoned by a cry from the hallway. A voice, high and frail and unmistakably frightened, had cut through the silence of the corridor at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 o'clock exactly, which would mean something later to the people who pieced the story together. The voice belonged to a very old woman. She was standing just outside the door in a dress that had not been washed in some time, her white hair loose around a face that had gone to hollows, her eyes enormous and dark and absolutely alert, in a way that the rest of her was not. She was 93 years old. She had not opened that door in 24 years. Inside the suite, the air carried a specific smell: rot, old paper, the faint sweetness of petroleum jelly, and cheap cigar smoke layered over years of closed windows and unwashed fabric. The lace curtains, once ivory, had gone the color of old bone. Every surface was stacked, newspapers in columns reaching to mid-thigh, cracker boxes flattened and refolded and stacked again, balls of used string saved from parcels received through the crack in the door, wrapping paper smoothed and preserved in piles that served no function except to be preserved. Two trunks sat in the corner, padlocked. The bathroom had been converted into a makeshift kitchen of sorts. A small gas ring balanced on the edge of the basin, a tin can washed and reused for boiling water. On the couch under a thin blanket lay an even older woman. She was not moving in the way that people move when they are sleeping. The physician stepped inside. He had worked in this part of Midtown for years and had seen rooms in poor condition. This was different. This was a room that had been sealed against the world for nearly a quarter century, and the world had not come in. Only time had. And in that time, something had been accumulating in those trunks and in the folds of that old woman's dress that no one in the hotel had ever suspected. Something that would, within 48 hours, make the front page of every newspaper in the country. The woman who had cried for help was a millionaire. Her name was Ida Wood, except that it was not. It had never been. The name Ida Wood was the last layer of a costume that had taken 50 years to build, and beneath it, in the bones of the woman, now standing in the doorway of Suite 552, with her white hair loose and her enormous dark eyes watching the physician examine her dying sister, was someone who had not existed in public in 50 years. A girl from Malden, Massachusetts, a girl named Ellen Walsh. We are drawn to stories about the rich who fall because they confirm something we want to believe: that money is not enough, that the lie always surfaces, that a life built on invented foundations will crack along those invented seams, and the crack will be public, and the collapse will be witnessed by the same people who watched the rise. We tell ourselves these stories are cautionary. We say we watch them to learn something about the relationship between wealth and character, between what we build and what we actually are underneath the building. But that is not entirely true, and we know it is not entirely true. We watch because there is a specific and somewhat shameful pleasure in watching someone who had everything: the name, the fortune, the Fifth Avenue carriage ride, the footman in livery, the dance with the future king of the British Empire. Discover that everything was only ever a performance, that the audience they had worked so hard to impress had always been watching a woman in a costume, that the costume was the performance, and the performance was the life, and the life. At the end of it was an unwashed dress in a hotel room full of cracker boxes and old newspapers, and a diamond necklace sitting in a box of stale crackers, because diamonds and crackers had become the same category of thing somewhere in the second decade of the sealed room. Ida Wood spent 40 years performing the role of a woman who deserved to be exactly where she was. She performed it for presidents and princes. She performed it at Delmonico's and the opera and the private homes of the families who formed the innermost ring of Gilded Age New York. She performed it every afternoon at 4 o'clock on Fifth Avenue with the parasol tilted at the exact correct angle against the sun, and the two footmen standing at rigid attention behind her in the carriage. She performed it across 3 decades of newspaper society columns that mentioned her name and described her beauty, and never once questioned the story she had told about herself, because the story had been told so consistently and with such total conviction that questioning it would have required a specific and unusual kind of suspicion that the social world she moved through did not generally apply to women who looked the way she looked and moved the way she moved and tilted the parasol at the angle she had decided was correct. And then one morning in 1907, something in her broke, or perhaps something in her finally, after 50 years, simply relaxed, and she walked out of the performance and into a hotel room and shut the door behind her. She shut it so completely that even the people who lived with her inside it, her two sisters who had followed her into the fiction of Ida Mayfield Wood decades earlier and had never found their way back out, spent the rest of their lives inside that closed room. The question this video is going to answer is not simply what she found inside that room. The question is what she was trying to get away from, and whether in 24 years of crackers and petroleum jelly and old newspapers and the money pressed flat against her skin, she ever actually found it. Here is the detail about Ida Wood that every newspaper got wrong when they found her in 1931. They reported that she had hidden $1 million inside her hotel suite. The actual sum, when the lawyers finished counting across weeks of careful inventory, was considerably larger than $1 million, and the hiding places were considerably stranger than anyone had initially reported. Stranger in ways that suggested not a calculated financial strategy, but something more personal, something closer to the private logic of a woman who had spent 50 years hiding the thing that mattered most to her, herself, and had extended that instinct naturally and completely to everything else she valued. There is the matter of the diamond necklace. A diamond necklace worth $40,000 found inside a box of stale crackers on a shelf in the suite, sitting among actual crackers, indistinguishable from them by anyone who had not reached inside. No one knows when she put it there. No one knows if she remembered it was there when the crackers grew stale around it. No one knows if the placement was deliberate concealment or the housekeeping of a woman for whom the boundary between valuables and provisions had dissolved somewhere in the first decade of the sealed room. There is the matter of what a nurse found while Ida slept. The nurse reached carefully into the folds of the unwashed dress and found an oilcloth pocket sewn directly into the lining, pressed flat against the old woman's body just below the ribs. Inside the pocket, $500,000 in $10,000 bills, folded into a tight brick, warm from contact with her skin. She had been sleeping with $500,000 against her body. She had been wearing it through the long days of reading newspapers and smoking Cuban cigars and rubbing petroleum jelly into her face in circles for hours. She had trusted it only to the warmth of her own body, the same body that was the only container she had ever fully trusted with anything she valued. There is the matter of the 54 trunks, not the 2 padlocked trunks in the corner of the suite. 54. Some in the hotel basement where they had been sitting since 1907, untouched for 24 years. Others in an uptown warehouse, similarly untouched. When the lawyers brought them all to the Harriman National Bank and opened them in the presence of witnesses, what they found was the physical record of a social life that had ended a quarter-century before. Bolts of the finest lace from Ireland, Venice, and Spain. Armfuls of exquisite evening gowns of the kind worn to balls attended by congressmen and socialites in the 1880s. Necklaces, bracelets, tiaras with stones still brilliant despite the decades in the dark of a hotel basement. Gold certificates in denominations of $1,000, $5,000, and $10,000 dating back to the 1860s. A gold-headed ebony walking stick, a Wood family heirloom given originally as a gift from President James Monroe, and a letter written in 1867 by Charles Dickens to Benjamin Wood, sitting folded in a trunk, unread for 24 years. A letter from Charles Dickens, in a trunk in a hotel basement, unread for 24 years. None of that is the strangest detail. The strangest detail is what the lawyers discovered only after she died. The woman who had spent 40 years as the toast of New York society, who had danced with the Prince of Wales and shaken hands with President-elect Lincoln, and ridden up Fifth Avenue in a carriage with two footmen in livery and run a newspaper with the largest circulation in the United States. That woman did not exist, had never existed, had been invented by a 19-year-old girl from Malden, Massachusetts, standing in a rented room in New York in 1857, looking at herself in whatever mirror was available in that rented room, and deciding, with a finality that would hold for 50 years without a single visible slip, to become someone else entirely. Ida Wood was one of the great impostors of the Gilded Age, a woman of zero social standing who manufactured an aristocratic identity from nothing and maintained it for half a century in the most status-conscious social environment in the country. If these stories matter to you, the ones about what it costs a person to become someone they are not, the ones about what waits on the other side of 50 years of performance, subscribe now. We go 3 times a week. Every story is built exactly like this one. Now let us go back to Malden, Massachusetts, in the 1840s, to a girl named Ellen Walsh, the daughter of an Irish peddler and a woman who grew up in the slums of Dublin. And let us understand what she saw when she looked at the world that had been assigned to her, and why she refused it. Ellen Walsh was born on the 14th of January, 1838, in Oldham, in the English county of Lancashire, the daughter of Thomas Walsh, an Irish peddler, and Anne Crawford, a woman who had grown up in the slums of Dublin and received almost no formal education. The family emigrated. They made the crossing and settled in Malden, Massachusetts in the 1840s when Ellen was still a small child. And Malden in the 1840s was the kind of New England mill town that had no particular imagination for the future of the people who had arrived there with nothing. The mills ran. The poor worked the mills. The merchants who owned the mills lived in the larger houses on the better streets, and their daughters did not work in the mills, and their sons went away to university and came back with professions, and the whole arrangement was presented as natural, as given as the correct and inevitable expression of how things distributed themselves among people of different inherent worth. Ellen Walsh was 7 years old when she began to understand this arrangement. She understood it with the specific comprehension of a child who has been placed on the wrong side of it and can see both sides clearly from where she stands. She saw the mill owners' daughters on the better streets in their dresses, and she looked at the dress her mother had made from what was available, and she did not feel grief. She felt something colder and more useful than grief. She felt the beginning of calculation. Her mother had one piece of wisdom she repeated with the consistency of liturgy. Knowledge is power. She said it the way people say things to children they cannot otherwise protect, as a tool, a shield, the only inheritance available to a woman with nothing material to leave behind. Ellen heard it. She heard it not as comfort, but as instruction, not as a platitude, but as a specific and actionable directive about how the world actually worked underneath the layer of social convention that made it appear to work on principles of natural order. The world did not work on natural order. The world worked on information and the strategic application of it. Ellen Walsh understood this at 7 years old and never forgot it. What she looked like in those early years, slight with long black hair and what one contemporary who met her years later described as sad, languorous eyes. The sadness in them was not grief, it was attention, the specific quality of sustained, unrelenting observation that develops in people who have had to watch carefully, because watching carefully was the only available instrument for understanding a world that did not explain itself to them directly. She was not conventionally pretty. Remarkable is the better word, and there is a fundamental difference between the two. Pretty is something you have. Remarkable is something you manufacture if you understand what the audience is looking for and are willing to do the sustained, patient, daily work of presenting exactly that thing. She read the society pages of the newspapers, not for the gossip. Gossip was information about the social world as it existed, and that was not the information she needed. She read them for the mechanism. How does a woman of no name and no money get inside the rooms where the name and money are kept? What is the exact sequence of moves? Where does it begin? What does the first step look like? What does it cost? And what does the person who takes it have to be willing to give up in order to take it? She read the columns about balls at Delmonico's and receptions at the opera and dinners at the private homes of the families who formed the inner ring of New York society, and she noted who was there and how they had gotten there and what the path from outside those rooms to inside them actually looked like when you traced it backward from the result to the first move. She understood that the first move could not be made from Malden. Malden was the wrong shape for what she was designing. The social world of Malden already knew what she was. It had known what she was since she was born. You cannot redesign yourself in a place that watched you arrive. You need a city that does not know you. A city large enough that a young woman can arrive and be, initially, whatever she says she is before anyone has the opportunity to measure it against what they already know. She chose New York. She arrived in New York in 1857 at the age of 19. She had already done two things before she unpacked the single trunk that contained everything she owned. She had changed her name. Ellen Walsh became Ida Mayfield. She chose the name herself in her teens, turning it over in her mind until it felt right in the way that certain things feel right when they are exactly what they need to be. Mayfield. It had the weight of land, of ownership, of roots in good soil that someone's family had worked for generations. Walsh was the name of a peddler, of a man who carried other people's goods from place to place and owned nothing of his own and died in San Francisco in 1864 without a dollar to his name. Mayfield was the name of someone who owned the field. Her sister Mary changed her name too, following Ida into the fiction the way younger siblings follow older ones into decisions they do not fully understand, understanding only that the older one has decided and that the decision has the quality of something already done. The second thing she had done before arriving in New York was invent a father, not a different name for the same man, an entirely different man in an entirely different place with an entirely different kind of life. Thomas Walsh, the Irish peddler, ceased to exist. In his place, she installed Henry Mayfield, a Louisiana sugar planter of substantial means, recently deceased, whose timely death had left his daughter in the position of a young woman of good Southern family temporarily reduced in circumstances and seeking her footing in New York City. Her mother, Anne Crawford of the Dublin slums, became Anne Mary Crawford, a descendant of the Earls of Crawford, a noble bloodline, English, ancient. The kind of ancestry that explained a certain refinement of manner in a young woman who might otherwise be difficult to place on the social map that New York maintained with the obsessive precision of a city that had no hereditary aristocracy and had invented one anyway. This is not a small lie. It deserves to be called what it is: architecture. A constructed identity with load-bearing walls and a foundation that had to be consistent across every surface it touched. It required maintenance. It required consistency across decades, across rooms, across conversations with people who were actively and professionally interested in placing her correctly on the social map. The social world of New York in the 1850s was not careless about provenance. People asked questions and they cross-referenced the answers, and they wrote letters to contacts in New Orleans and waited for replies that either confirmed or denied what they had been told. No reply ever came that disproved her because she had chosen Louisiana with care. Louisiana in the 1850s was sufficiently distant from New York, sufficiently disrupted by the political turmoil of the approaching Civil War, sufficiently difficult to verify through the available channels of communication that a plausible claim of Southern aristocracy was nearly impossible to disprove from New York. She had studied the gap between what the social world required and what it could actually verify, and she had stepped into that gap with the calm of someone who has measured the distance carefully and knows it can be crossed. She was 19 years old when she identified the gap, 19 when she stepped into it. The reading of the society pages had also identified something more specific than a general strategy: a man, a particular man, whose name appeared regularly enough that his position in New York was legible to anyone reading carefully. Benjamin Wood, 37 years old. Married, but the marriage was understood to be an arrangement of mutual convenience that the social conventions of the era maintained in public without requiring it to constrain behavior in private. He was a politician, a 3-time congressman, and 2-time member of the New York State Senate. He co-owned the New York Daily News, at that time the most widely circulated newspaper in the city. His brother Fernando Wood was the mayor of New York. He was known to enjoy the company of beautiful women, to have significant difficulty managing money despite making significant amounts of it, and to be the kind of man who responds to being seen, who is susceptible, specifically, to women who look at him as though they have assessed him carefully and decided his worth is considerable. On the 28th of May, 1857, Ida Mayfield sent Benjamin Wood a letter. She had spent money she did not have on the paper it was written on, because the paper was part of the message. The paper said that the woman who had written on it was someone who understood that presentation was substance, not decoration. The letter read, in relevant part, "I venture to address you from hearing a young lady, one of your former loves, speak of you. She says you are fond of new faces. I fancy that as I am new in the city, I might contract an agreeable intimacy with you. I believe I am not extremely bad-looking. Perhaps not quite as handsome as the lady with you at present, but I know a little more, and there is an old saying, 'Knowledge is power.'" She had quoted her mother's only piece of wisdom to a man who did not know her mother existed and would never in 33 years of marriage learn the truth of who her mother was. He agreed to meet her. He found a slender girl with long black hair and sad dark eyes. She told him about her father, the Louisiana sugar planter, about her mother, the descendant of earls. Benjamin Wood was a man who had found money easy to come by and easier to spend, who was inside a marriage that had satisfied certain social requirements without satisfying much else, and who was susceptible in the specific way that powerful men are susceptible to women who look at them as though they already know what they are worth. She became his mistress that same year. She was 19 years old. He was 37 and married. She had been in New York for weeks. The lie had found its first load-bearing wall, and both of them knew it. And neither of them said so. They were together for 10 years before they married. Ida was, in the vocabulary of the era, a kept woman. She was kept very well, and she understood with complete clarity that being kept well was not the goal, but the mechanism. The means by which a woman of her origins could access rooms she would otherwise never enter, establish herself in those rooms, and build from that access something durable enough to sustain itself without the man who had initially enabled it. She had no intention of remaining indefinitely dependent on Benjamin Wood's generosity. She was building. Every event she attended, every name she added to her working knowledge of the social world, every room she entered through Benjamin's connection and proved herself capable of inhabiting without visible effort, all of it was material for the structure she was building. The structure was a life, a complete, fully realized, internally consistent life for a woman who had not existed when she arrived at the city. In 1860, she danced with the Prince of Wales, Edward, the future king. Edward VII was visiting New York on the first tour of North America by an heir to the British throne, and the ball thrown in his honor at the Academy of Music on 14th Street was the social event of the decade, the event that every person of position in New York attended or pretended they had been invited to. The city's elite came in full dress. Ida Wood came in full performance. She danced with the future king of the British Empire, the girl from Oldham, Lancashire, the daughter of the Dublin slum mother, and the Irish peddler who had died without a dollar. And the newspapers wrote about her bright plumage and fragile beauty, and called her a belle of New Orleans, and not one reporter who wrote those words had any reason to doubt them. Less than a year later, she met Abraham Lincoln when he passed through New York on the way from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln stopped in the city. There was a reception. Ida Wood was in the room. She shook the hand of a man who would become one of the most consequential figures in American history, and he had no reason to know that the charming woman of Southern family standing before him, the woman who smiled and said the right things and wore the right dress and held herself with the posture of someone whose right to be in that room had never been in question, was the daughter of a man who had died in San Francisco in 1864 without a dollar to his name. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, without exception, Ida went for her carriage ride. 2 liveried footmen attended her. She stopped at the Manhattan Club on Fifth Avenue, and Benjamin Wood came out immediately when she called for him, the way a man comes out when his wife's routine is so established that its timing has the quality of a natural fact. And together they rode up the avenue with the parasol tilted at the exact correct angle against the afternoon sun. People watched from the sidewalk. The city watched. The city saw exactly what Ida had designed it to see, a woman of absolute rightful membership in the world she occupied, whose right to be in the carriage with the parasol and the footman was as unquestionable as the carriage itself. She was simultaneously the most careful saver of money Benjamin Wood had ever encountered, and this was not accidental. It was the central strategy of her financial life, more consequential than any other decision she made about money, because it was the decision that would determine whether the position she had built survived Benjamin or died with him. Benjamin was a gambler. He played cards at John Morrissey's gambling hall on Lower Broadway, where fortunes changed hands at the roulette table with the casual speed of men who believed money was renewable because it had always renewed before. He once wagered the Daily News itself in a card game and won that hand, which told Ida everything she needed to know about what would happen the hand he did not win. She addressed the risk the way she addressed every problem, directly, without sentiment, with a specific legal mechanism. She made him sign things over to her, legally, piece by piece over the decade of their affair and the 33 years of their subsequent marriage, which arrived in 1867 after Benjamin's second wife, Delia, died. The properties and the newspaper shares and the financial assets moved from his name to hers. She told him the arrangement clearly. She would not object to his gambling. His losses were his own. His winnings she split with him. He agreed. He wrote apologetic notes when he lost badly, signed, "Unfortunately for you, your husband Ben." The notes arrived. She kept everyone. The assets accumulated in her name. One more deception was load-bearing, and she maintained it with the same seamless competence she brought to every other element of the fiction. The woman everyone in their social world knew as Emma Wood, presented as Benjamin and Ida's daughter, was not their daughter. Emma was Ida's younger sister, brought into New York, installed in the role of child, maintained in that role across decades of public life without a single visible crack. Benjamin knew. He had always known. He kept the secret for 33 years without being asked to keep it again and took it to his grave in 1900, leaving no record of it. By the 1870s, the Wood household had reached what would become its peak, and the peak was specific and textured in ways the society columns only partially captured. The apartment at the Grand Fifth Avenue Hotel on 8th Street was large enough to hold the scale of life that Ida had decided they would live. The rooms were furnished with the specific taste of a woman who had studied the interiors of the houses she had entered through Benjamin's connections and had identified, with the precision she brought to everything, exactly what communicated the right kind of position. Not ostentatious. Ida was never ostentatious, because ostentatious was what people were when they needed to prove something they were not sure of, and Ida had decided that she was sure of herself. The furniture was excellent without being showy. The laces she collected were Irish and Venetian and Spanish, the finest available, bought with the eye of a woman who understood fabric the way she understood social position, as a system with rules that rewarded precision. The tiaras and the necklaces and the bracelets she acquired across those years had stones whose quality she assessed herself, because she trusted her own assessment and no one else's. The 4 o'clock carriage ride continued every day across decades. The footmen were always in livery. The parasol was always tilted at the correct angle. The Manhattan Club was always the stop. And Benjamin always came out when she called for him. And they always rode up Fifth Avenue together with the specific posture of a couple whose right to that particular demonstration had never been questioned and could not be. The evenings were Delmonico's on 26th Street, where the tables went until midnight and the champagne was always French, and the guest lists included the names that appeared in the society columns as markers of the city's inner ring. The Vanderbilt Circle, the Astor Circle, the smaller orbits of political families and newspaper families that surrounded the commercial dynasties and gave them their social texture. Ida Wood's name appeared in those columns regularly through the 1870s and 1880s, attached to events that constituted, by any measure of the era, the highest level of social life New York produced. She was not at the apex, not the Vanderbilt tier or the Astor tier, not the women who spent $250,000 on a single ball or built Newport cottages modeled on the palaces of Versailles. She was one step below that tier, in the specific position she had calculated she could hold without overextending the resources she had available, and without making the mistake of claiming altitude she could not sustain if examined too closely. The opera at the Academy of Music on 14th Street, which remained the primary venue for operatic performance in New York, until the Metropolitan Opera opened on Broadway and 39th Street in 1883. Ida attended both. She had a box because boxes were the visible proof of membership of a specific kind, the kind that did not need to be announced because the box announced it. She sat in the box in the correct dress with the correct jewels, and watched the performances with the composed attention of a woman for whom the performance on stage was considerably less interesting than the performance in the boxes around her. Who was there and with whom, and what their presence communicated to the other people watching the boxes rather than the stage. She read the society columns about herself with the same careful attention she had always brought to reading the society columns about other people. She was looking for cracks, a word slightly off, a description that suggested the reporter had found something inconsistent between what she had said on one occasion and what she had said on another. She never found anything. The columns called her a belle of New Orleans. They admired her bright plumage and her fragile beauty. They described her as the wife of the congressman and newspaper publisher Benjamin Wood, the sister-in-law of the mayor, a woman of evident social accomplishment, whose position in the city's inner ring was one of those facts that went unremarked because unremarkable things go unremarked. The Daily News grew under Benjamin's ownership to the largest circulation of any newspaper in the United States. His political career continued through 3 terms in Congress and 2 in the state Senate. His brother Fernando Wood dominated New York politics through the Tammany Hall machine that had organized the city's Democratic Party into a force that defined municipal governance for a generation. Ida moved through all of it. She was present at the events. She was mentioned in the columns. She maintained the parasol and the footman and the 4 o'clock carriage ride and the boxes at the opera and the tables at Delmonico's, and the relationship with the social world that Benjamin's position had made accessible and that she had maintained through 50 years of daily, disciplined, unrelenting performance. And she saved. While Benjamin spent at Morrissey's gambling hall on Lower Broadway, she saved. While he wrote the apologetic notes signed with his rueful signature, she accumulated. While he gambled the newspaper in card games he was lucky enough to win, she arranged that the newspaper was legally hers anyway. The gap between what Benjamin spent and what Ida held grew wider with each year of the marriage. He found money easy to come by and easier to spend. Ida found it impossible to release from her own control. Here is the thing about the peak of Ida Wood's social life that is easy to miss if you are looking at it from the outside. It was exhausting. Not the parties themselves, not the carriage rides, not the opera boxes. Those were the visible surface of something that operated entirely on maintenance, on the daily discipline of checking every visible element of the performance against the standard she had set for it and correcting anything that had drifted. The performance required this of her every day, without exception, without the possibility of a day off, because a day off from being Ida Mayfield Wood was a day of being Ellen Walsh, and Ellen Walsh had not existed in public for 30 years and could not be allowed to exist now. She had no friends in the sense that the word usually means. She had acquaintances, social contacts, women she met regularly at the events her position required her to attend, and with whom she exchanged the conversation that the events required. She did not confide in any of them. She could not. Confidence requires a degree of disclosure, and disclosure was the thing Ida Wood had organized her entire adult life around avoiding. Every woman who sat across from her at Delmonico's believed she was sitting across from a woman of Southern family, the wife of a congressman, a belle of New Orleans, whose refinement had been shaped by an upbringing in the sugar planter aristocracy of Louisiana. Not one of them was sitting across from Ellen Walsh. Only Benjamin was. and Benjamin had decided, at some point in the early years of their relationship, that this was acceptable, that the woman he was actually with was worth more to him than the woman she claimed to be, and that the claim was simply a mechanism for getting her into the rooms where he had found her and where she continued to prove, every day, that she belonged. He gambled and lost and wrote his apologetic notes, and she managed the money and the household and the social calendar and the fiction, and the arrangement worked in the specific way that arrangements work when both parties understand exactly what is being exchanged, and neither of them requires it to be something else. When Benjamin Wood died on the 13th of February 1900 at the apartment at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the New York Times reported accurately that he left almost no real estate and personal property of small value. What he had spent across 40 years of marriage had exceeded, by a significant margin, what the Daily News had earned him. The assets that remained were in Ida's name. They had always been in Ida's name. This had always been the arrangement. She was 62 years old, a millionaire many times over. The Daily News was hers. The railroad stocks and bonds accumulated across decades of careful investment were hers. The gold certificates dating to the 1860s were hers. The Irish and Venetian and Spanish laces, the gem-encrusted jewelry, the evening gowns, the gold-headed ebony walking stick from President Monroe. All of it was in her name, in the trunks and vaults she managed with the focused attention of a woman who knew that nothing stayed safe unless you watched it yourself. She was also, for the first time in her adult life, entirely alone in the fiction. Benjamin had known who she was. He was gone. Now the only people alive who knew the truth were her two sisters, who had been inside the fiction with her since the beginning, and who had no more ability to step outside it than she did. She tried the editorship of the Daily News. She walked into the offices on Park Row and took Benjamin's chair and began making decisions with the focused competence she brought to everything she had ever decided to master. She hired people she wanted and fired people she did not, and she made enemies of the staff who had served Benjamin loyally for years and who did not understand why the publisher's widow was in the publisher's chair, acting as though the newspaper had always been hers. It had always been hers. She had made Benjamin sign it over years before he died. The legal reality and the practical reality of walking into a building full of men who had worked for someone else were two different things, and the men made the difference felt in the ways that men in such positions make it felt. Through the slow, grinding resistance of people who consider your authority illegitimate and are waiting for you to give up. She did not give up. She drove the paper into the ground first. The resignations came, the circulation declined. The editorial direction she had imposed confused readers who had been accustomed to Benjamin's instincts for what New York wanted to read. In late 1901, she sold it. Frank Munsey paid her over $250,000 for her shares. She had one condition: pay her in $1,000 bills. He complied. She folded them carefully and put them somewhere safe, in the specific manner that had become her instinctive response to cash. Remove it from institutional custody and place it within her own. Munsey called the Daily News a serious newspaper and shut it down 2 years later. The paper that Benjamin had built to the largest circulation in the United States ended without ceremony in 1903. Ida read about it in the other papers. She did not publicly comment. She was liquidating the apartment, not in panic. In the methodical way she did everything. The furniture went first, the excellent pieces she had selected with such precision across 40 years of the life she had built. Then the oil paintings came off the walls, leaving the pale rectangles that revealed how long they had hung there and how completely they had been the room. Then the tapestries, the sculptures, the decorative objects that had expressed the position of the Wood household across 40 years of public life. Each piece went to a buyer. Each sale generated cash that went to the Guaranty Trust Company. The apartment at the Fifth Avenue Hotel was becoming bare in a way that was visible to anyone who had known it when it was full, though the people who had known it when it was full were no longer coming to visit. Benjamin's social world had been Benjamin's. Without him, it had dissolved back into the city from which it had come. She was still taking the 4 o'clock carriage ride, every afternoon, with the footman, with the parasol. The city around the carriage was changing. More automobiles on the streets now, the new century's technology beginning to replace the rhythms of the old one. But the carriage continued, and the parasol continued, and the posture continued, because the carriage ride was the last public signal she was still sending, the last visible evidence to anyone watching, that Ida Mayfield Wood remained exactly what she had always presented herself to be, a woman of position, a woman of certainty, a woman whose right to be in the carriage had never required justification. Then she stopped sending the signal. In the autumn of 1906, the financial pages began carrying a specific kind of anxiety that Ida recognized immediately. Because she had been reading financial pages with the same focused attention she brought to society columns for 40 years. Bank instability, trust company failures in smaller markets, the particular kind of language that appears in newspapers when the people writing them know something is wrong but have not yet agreed on what to call it. The panic of 1907 had not yet arrived, but its architecture was legible in the press for anyone reading carefully enough. Ida Wood had spent 40 years trusting her own reading over the reassurances of anyone with an interest in being reassuring. She was not reassured. One morning she walked into the Guarantee Trust Company and told the officer on duty she wished to close her account, all of it in cash. That morning, the officer explained the impracticality. The sum was approaching $1 million. A withdrawal of that magnitude required notice, required the bank to arrange the currency, required time. She told him that if he refused, she would inform everyone she knew. And she paused to let him calculate how many people that was and what their collective power in the financial world of New York represented. That the Guarantee Trust Company was insolvent. He arranged the cash. She walked out with close to $1 million in $500 and $1,000 bills stuffed into canvas bags and did not look back at the building. She and Mary and Emma packed 57 steamer trunks in the bare apartment at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. The trunks contained the remaining physical evidence of the life she had built, the laces and the gowns and the jewelry and the gold certificates and the walking stick and the Dickens letter and the gold certificates and the documents and the 40 years of accumulated material proof that Ida Mayfield Wood had been exactly who she said she was. Most of the trunks went to the basement of the Herald Square Hotel at 19 West 31st Street. Several went to an uptown warehouse. The three women, the three Walsh sisters from Malden, Massachusetts, who had entered New York as the Mayfields and had become the Woods and had maintained the fiction across 50 years without a visible crack, took the elevator to the 5th floor of the Herald Square Hotel and walked down the corridor to rooms 551 and 552. The door closed. Ida Wood was 69 years old. She had been performing since she was 19, 50 years. And now the door, and the silence, and the room, and for the first time in 50 years, no audience. What happened inside room 552 over the next 24 years exists in the record only in fragments, because the women inside it maintained their refusal of contact with extraordinary and unbroken consistency. The bellhop, who knocked daily to ask if they needed anything, received only what they chose to give. A request for supplies passed through the crack in the door, a brief exchange that confirmed they were alive and did not require medical attention, and then silence until the following day. They ordered eggs, bacon, crackers, evaporated milk, coffee, occasionally a piece of fish. They asked for Cuban cigars for Ida, who smoked them with the deliberate patience of someone for whom smoking had become a way of marking the hours in a space where the hours were otherwise indistinguishable from each other, one morning identical to the next, the light through the sealed windows identical, the smell of old paper and petroleum jelly identical, the sounds of the city outside muffled to a general noise that had no particular content. They asked for jars of petroleum jelly, which Ida applied to her face every day for hours at a time, rubbing it into the skin of her forehead and cheeks and chin in slow circles that the people who eventually entered the room understood as a ritual of some kind, whose original purpose she had either forgotten or never disclosed. The sweet deteriorated slowly, and then less slowly, and then in the way that things deteriorate when no one is reversing the deterioration. Steadily, completely, until the deterioration was the condition of the room rather than a departure from it. The lace curtains went from ivory to old bone to the specific gray-brown of fabric that has absorbed years of closed-room air and will not wash clean. The newspapers, delivered daily through the crack in the door, because Ida still read the papers, every day, still tracked the financial pages and the society columns and the news of a city she was no longer physically part of, stacked and restacked across the floor and on every surface, the older ones compressed into foundations for the newer ones. Until the stacks had become the architecture of the room. You navigated the room by the stacks. They were the furniture now. The cracker boxes accumulated, flattened, and stacked. The balls of string saved from every parcel that came through the door. The wrapping paper smoothed flat and preserved in piles with the care of a woman who had learned in childhood that nothing useful should be discarded when you could not be certain that something equally useful would be available when you needed it. The room was becoming a physical expression of a mind that could not release anything, could not throw away a newspaper or a cracker box or a ball of string any more than it had been able to throw away the identity it had built in 1857, or the name it had chosen because it liked the sound of it. Outside the sealed windows, New York was doing what New York does, changing rapidly, loudly, and without any particular concern for what it was leaving behind. The automobiles replaced the carriages on Fifth Avenue. The mansions of the Gilded Age were being converted to other uses, or demolished to make way for buildings whose purposes their original owners could not have imagined. The Metropolitan Opera had moved to its new building on Broadway. Delmonico's had moved and moved again and would eventually close entirely in 1923. The world in which Ida Mayfield Wood had danced with the Prince of Wales and ridden up Fifth Avenue with 2 footmen in livery had been replaced, gradually and then completely, by a world that did not know she existed. She read about all of it through the crack in the door. She tracked the changes in the papers that came daily. She smoked her cigars and applied her petroleum jelly and watched the light move across the stacked newspapers and read about a world she had stepped out of in 1907 and had not re-entered. In 1928, Emma Wood died inside the suite. Emma Walsh. The youngest sister, the woman who had spent her entire adult life playing the role of Ida's daughter, died in those 2 rooms at the age of 71 after 21 years of the sealed life. She had gone into the hotel in 1907 as a woman of 50, still within the working years of a life that might have been many things. She died in 1928 in a room full of stacked newspapers, having been no one's daughter and no one's sister in any way the world outside knew, having been instead a prop in a fiction she had not invented and had never had the occasion or perhaps the will to refuse. The undertaker was informed through the crack in the door. The coffin went out. The door closed. Ida and Mary stayed. The years after Emma's death contracted the suite further around the 2 remaining women. The stacks grew. The papers came. The petroleum jelly was applied. The cigars were smoked. Mary Mayfield, Mary Walsh, was failing by early 1931. She was 91 years old, hollowed by age and by 2 decades of the hermit life, the body doing what bodies do when they have been kept indoors and unstimulated and fed on crackers and evaporated milk, and the specific kind of emotional stasis that comes from living inside a fiction that has been over for 20 years but has not yet been formally concluded. On the 5th of March, 1931, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 o'clock. The hour of the carriage ride, the hour that had apparently maintained its significance in Ida's internal clock across 24 years of a life without external schedules. Mary's breathing changed. Ida had been listening to it for days. She knew the change when it arrived. She opened the door. For the first time in 24 years, she craned her white head into the corridor of the Herald Square Hotel and called for help. The physician came. Lainitswanim. Behind him, the hotel manager, who had known for years that the women in 552 were unusual occupants, but had maintained the professional policy of not inquiring too specifically into the private arrangements of guests who paid their bills on time. Behind the manager came lawyers from the firm of O'Brien, Boardman, Conboy, Memhard, and Early, appearing with the particular efficiency of lawyers who have been informed that something financially significant may be in the process of occurring. Mary died that day, 91 years old. Mary Walsh, who had followed Ida into New York in 1857 and changed her name from Walsh to Mayfield and lived inside the fiction of Ida Mayfield Wood for 50 years, died in a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan as Mary Mayfield, the name she had borrowed at 19 and carried until there was nothing left of her to carry it. The lawyers looked around the suite. They looked at the columns of yellowed newspapers, the stacked cracker boxes, the two padlocked trunks in the corner, the tin can on the bathroom basin. They looked at the very old woman in the unwashed dress sitting in the middle of all of it, smoking a thin cigar with dark eyes that had not lost, despite everything, light. The quality of careful observation that had defined them since she was a girl in Malden reading the society pages for the mechanism rather than the gossip. She told them her name was Ida Mayfield Wood. She told them her husband had been Benjamin Wood, the congressman and newspaper publisher. She told them she had been a woman of society. She told them she was wealthy. The room made skepticism seem like the rational response. They were skeptical in the professional, careful way of lawyers who have heard extraordinary claims in ordinary rooms before. Then one of them found the shoebox. Inside, $247,200 in cash, in $1,000 and $5,000 bills, folded without ceremony into a shoebox on a shelf, alongside receipts and miscellany that had been accumulating there for 2 decades. One of the lawyers sat down and did not immediately stand back up. Within 48 hours, the search had located the oilcloth pocket in the dress. The nurse's hand reaching carefully through the folds of the unwashed fabric to find $500,000 in $10,000 bills, pressed warm against the old woman's skin. Within days, the 54 trunks were at the Harriman National Bank, their contents inventoried and placed in vaults. The diamond necklace was discovered inside the cracker box during the second week of the search. The Dickens letter was authenticated. The gold certificates were dated and valued. The total estate, when the lawyers finished their full accounting, exceeded $1 million. In the depths of the Depression, when families of 4 survived on a few $100s a year, word spread immediately. Harold Wentworth, the lawyer assigned to visit Ida daily, brought fresh roses every morning. She put some in a tin can of water. Others she snapped the buds from and tossed over her shoulder without looking to see where they fell. She smoked her cigars and applied her petroleum jelly and watched Harold with the patient, undeceived assessment of a woman who had spent 93 years watching men try to get something from her, and had developed across those years a precise and reliable instrument for measuring exactly how much they wanted and exactly how far they were willing to go. The fortune hunters came in numbers that suggested the story had reached every person in the country with a tenuous connection to anyone named Wood or Mayfield. Over 1,103 people filed claims on the estate before the court stopped counting new ones. People arrived from Louisiana with witnesses who had known the Mayfield plantation, elderly men who testified to knowing Ida's supposed father, Henry Mayfield, and who contradicted themselves so thoroughly under examination by the surrogate court that the judge dismissed their testimony entirely. The contradiction was not their fault. There was no Mayfield plantation. There had never been a Henry Mayfield. There had never been anyone there for them to know. In September of 1931, the courts declared Ida incompetent to manage her own affairs. She was moved from the 5th floor to the 4th floor of the Herald Square Hotel, one flight down in the company of 2 nurses and the lawyers and the representatives of various Wood family factions who had assembled around her estate with the focused attention of people who had not known the estate existed until it was almost too late to reach it. She wept during the move, not at the incompetency ruling, at leaving the rooms. At leaving suite 552, the door she had closed in 1907, the door that had held for 24 years, the door behind which she had finally, after 50 years of performing Ida Wood, been no one in particular. She looked back once at the door, and then she went downstairs. She died on the 12th of March, 1932, bronchial pneumonia, 94 years old. In the 4th floor rooms of the Herald Square Hotel, in the company of nurses she had not chosen, 1 year and 7 days after she had opened the door and called for help. The obituary ran at the top of page 1 of the New York Times the following morning. The rich recluse of Herald Square, the mystery millionaire, the little widow. The papers had developed epithets that circled around her without landing, because she would not resolve into any of the categories they tried to assign her. Eccentric, socialite, recluse, millionaire. None of these was wrong. None was sufficient. Joseph A. Cox, the attorney assigned to investigate her estate for the Surrogate Court of New York County, spent 5 years tracing the actual history of Ida Mayfield Wood. He went to Massachusetts and Ireland and England, following the paper trail of the real family. The Walshes, the Crawfords, the actual bloodline that Ellen Walsh had decided in 1857 was not the one she intended to carry forward. He found the baptismal record in Oldham, the immigration records in Massachusetts, the death record for Thomas Walsh, the peddler, in San Francisco in 1864. A man who had died without knowing that the daughter he had lost track of somewhere between Massachusetts and New York had become the mistress of a congressman and the most carefully constructed social impostor in the history of the American Gilded Age. The estate went to 10 authenticated relatives, people named Walsh mostly, people in England and Ireland and the United States who had never heard of Ida Wood. The 1,100 claimants received nothing. The money went to strangers who had not known it existed, from a woman who had built it under a name that was not her own. There is something that deserves to be examined before this story resolves. The cracker box, a diamond necklace worth $40,000, in a box of crackers, on a shelf in a hotel suite sealed for 24 years, surrounded by actual crackers in a room full of newspapers and string and accumulated preservation of things that had no particular reason to be preserved except that she could not bring herself to release them. She had worn that necklace to the balls and opera evenings and private dinners of the 1880s. She had worn it at Delmonico's and the Academy of Music and the homes of the families whose names she had memorized from the society columns in Malden before she had ever entered a room where those families gathered. The necklace had been the punctuation of a specific kind of sentence, the sentence that said, "Look at where I am. Look at what I have become from what I was. Look at the distance I have traveled from Oldham and Malden and the Dublin slums my mother described to me." And then she put it in a cracker box, not in a locked trunk with the gold certificates, not in the oilcloth pocket against her skin with the bills she trusted most, in a cracker box with crackers on a shelf. You can read this as the disorder of a woman whose relationship with objects had dissolved after 2 decades of isolation. Or you can read it as the final private word on what the necklace had always been. Not a treasure, a prop, a thing whose entire value had resided in what it communicated to an audience that no longer existed. Without the audience, the $40,000 diamond necklace was something you put in a cracker box and stopped thinking about. Without the carriage and the footman and the Fifth Avenue afternoon and the opera box and the society column description of your bright plumage and fragile beauty, the necklace was just weight, just a thing, a cracker among crackers. What she never put in a cracker box was the money, the bills against her skin, the cash in the shoebox, the gold certificates in the trunks. These had never been props. The necklace had communicated membership. The money had been power. Ellen Walsh's mother had told her that knowledge was power, but what Ellen Walsh discovered in New York over 50 years of becoming Ida Wood was that money was power of a more reliable kind. Knowledge could be questioned. Money could be counted. What you could count, you could control. What you could control, you could trust. And what you could trust was the only thing worth having. She had kept the money against her body because it was the only thing she had ever fully trusted, not the social world, which required constant maintenance and could expose her at any moment if she let the maintenance lapse, not the banks, which had required a threat to release her own funds, not the people around her, not Mary, not Emma, not Benjamin, who had loved her and kept her secret and died still keeping it. She had managed them. Management is not trust. She had trusted the money. She had trusted the warmth of it against her skin, and the weight of the oilcloth pocket pressing against her ribs, and the physical, countable, verifiable fact of it, the proof that the girl from Malden had done what she had set out to do. The cost that appears in none of the estate inventories, and none of the newspaper accounts, and none of the legal filings of the surrogate court of New York County is the cost paid by the two women who sealed themselves inside those rooms alongside Ida Wood and never came out. Mary Mayfield had been Mary Walsh, the sister who followed Ida into New York in 1857 and changed her name because Ida changed hers, and Mary followed, who had lived inside the fiction of Ida Mayfield Wood for 50 years in the supporting role of sister to a woman who had invented both of them. She lived in those two rooms for 24 years, from 67 to 91. She saw no one except Ida and Emma and the bellhop's hand through the crack in the door. The record shows no relationships she maintained outside the suite, no correspondence, no interests or activities that extended beyond what could be sustained inside two rooms on the fifth floor of a midtown hotel. She had followed Ida into the rented room in New York in 1857. She had followed Ida into the Herald Square Hotel in 1907. She died inside, without having inhabited, at any point in her adult life, a world that was entirely her own. Emma Walsh had been installed as Emma Wood, daughter of the household, for decades of social life in New York. She had been the daughter when the household required a daughter. She had appeared in the society columns as the Wood child. She had maintained the fiction of her parentage across rooms full of people who had no reason to question it. She had followed Ida into the hotel in 1907 and died there in 1928, 71 years old, in a room full of stacked newspapers, having been a daughter to a woman who was actually her sister for the entirety of her adult life, and having left no record of having once refused. 3 women. 3 lives. All of them organized around a story that belonged to one of them. Ida built the fiction, and Ida decided when the performance was over. Mary and Emma had no equivalent decision to make. They had been inside the story when the story ended, and they stayed inside it because the story was the only world they had been living in for 50 years, and there was no world outside it that still had a place for them. The newspapers did not write about this in 1931. The story they told was about extraordinary eccentricity and hidden millions. What they did not tell was the story of the 2 women who had made the eccentricity possible by following Ida in and never finding the way back out. Toward the end, when the nurses had made her as comfortable as they could and the lawyers had stopped coming with questions she could no longer hear clearly, and the 4th-floor room had settled into the quiet that precedes a particular kind of ending, Ida shared one final memory with the people around her. When she was a young girl in Malden, she had seen a sign in a storefront window, "Your future and fortune told." She had saved the money for a consultation because she had always saved, always, even then, even when there was almost nothing to save, and gone into the parlor and sat across from the old fortune-teller and held out her hands. The fortune-teller had traced rough fingertips across her palms. "My dear," she had said, "you are going to be a very lucky girl. You are going to marry a rich man, and you are going to get everything you want out of this life." Ida Wood had believed it, not as faith, as fact, as a thing the world had already decided and was simply waiting for her to go and claim. She had gone to New York, and she had claimed the rich man and the social position and the dance with the future king and the handshake with the president-elect and the carriage on Fifth Avenue with the 2 footmen in livery and the parasol tilted at the exact correct angle against the sun. She had gotten everything she had wanted, and she had wanted, in the end, to be in 2 rooms on the 5th floor of the Herald Square Hotel with her sisters and her cigars and her petroleum jelly and her newspapers and the money she trusted only against her own skin. That was what everything had turned out to be. Not the balls or the opera boxes or the Delmonico's tables or the society columns or the prince's hand in hers during a dance at the Academy of Music. The sealed room, the closed door, the quiet in which there was finally, after 50 years of performance, no one watching. This is what it costs Not the mansion or the Newport cottage or the English Duke or the ball that cost $250,000 for a single evening. The specific cost of wanting so much that you become the wanting, that the self who does the wanting disappears inside the performance of it, and when the performance finally ends, you find yourself in two hotel rooms with two sisters who followed you in and could not find the way out, and nothing on the shelf worth eating, and the diamond sitting in the crackers, and the money warm against your skin, and a quiet that is either peace or its precise opposite, and no one alive on earth who knows which one you have found. She had wanted everything. She had gotten it. She had paid for it in the only currency that actually cost her anything, in the people to whom she could not be known, in the 50 years of maintaining a performance for which the backstage was a rented room, and the only people who knew the real script were the two sisters she had brought into the fiction with her, and who had never found their way back out. She wore the money against her body until they took it. She had worn herself against the world until she could not any more. And at the end, when the door finally opened and the physician came and the lawyers came and the fortune hunters came and the newspapers came and the world she had sealed out for 24 years came flooding back in through the crack in the door she had held shut with nothing except her own extraordinary, unbroken, exhausting will. At the very end, she sat in the middle of all of it and smoked her thin cigar and watched them with the dark, patient, assessing eyes of a woman who had been watching people try to take things from her since she was 19 years old and had not, even now, even at 93, even in an unwashed dress in a room full of cracker boxes and yellowed newspapers and the smell of petroleum jelly and decades, stopped watching. The hotel is gone. The suite is gone. The crackers are long dust. The necklace is in some archive or private vault or dispersed into the accounting of an estate that took years to close. The newspapers she saved for 24 years have yellowed past reading. The gold certificates are in a museum somewhere or lost, or in the hands of the authenticated Walsh relatives who inherited the estate of a woman they had never known existed. The oilcloth pocket was still warm when the nurse found it. She had kept the money against her body until they took it. She had built a life from nothing, from a borrowed name and an invented father and a letter written on good paper she had saved up to buy, and she had held that life against her skin for 50 years, the way she held the money, the warmth of it, the only proof she trusted that she had done what she had set out to do. That warmth was the last true thing about Ellen Walsh.